Welcome back. We're going to look at part 2 of the Industrial Revolution. So let's begin. So the Industrial Revolution is probably, I think I'm going to say this, is my favorite unit of History 10. This is an occurrence that happened, we could put between about 1700 and 1850. Of course, industrialization continued to happen after 1850, well into the 1900s. And of course, countries today are still industrializing. But in terms of its initial happenings in a few key parts in the world, as we'll talk about, 1700 to about 1850 are some good pinpointing dates for us. So we'll keep that in mind. So in other words, this is happening in places in the world while, Great Britain is developing its limited monarchy, while Americans are gaining their independence. And even while the French are having their French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution is in the background of that whole occurrence, that whole span of time. And we're going to look at the results of the Industrial Revolution, the advances we see in the revolution, and the eventual effects on society, because this is not a political revolution. This is a technological and an economic one that also influences social and society. So it's kind of like a social revolution as well, because it changes the way we live. Let's take a look. We're going to look at a video real quick. So let's pop this video open.
In the late 1700s, most people worked in the fields on land they did not own. Those who owned the land, called aristocrats, lived refined lives in elegant manor houses. Servants raised their children and did their housework. The landowners and the people who worked for them depended upon each other. It was a system that had existed for centuries. In towns across England and the United States, a series of extraordinary innovations would alter the way people lived and worked for the next 150 years. Inventors had found new ways to harness nature's energy. They built new kinds of machines powered by water, steam, and coal. The new machines replaced hand-powered tools. They did the same work, only cheaper and faster. Much of the work was done outside the home, in specially designed buildings, the first factories. Mechanization began in the textile mills of England, where one machine attached to a spinning wheel could do the work of 50 people. Fuel, clothing, and food all became more affordable. With the development of locomotives and steamboats, manufactured goods could now be sold halfway around the world. Families moved from the villages of their ancestors to new industrial towns. And a new class of people emerged, workers who produced goods. Industrialists, the people who owned the factories, employed hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. And they made enormous profits in their industrial centers. But while the Industrial Revolution brought wealth to some and jobs for others, it came with a price tag. Pollution from coal-powered factories turned the cities black. Lack of housing created the first urban slums. And the demand for more and more goods and higher profits brought the exploitation of workers, including children. Some of the worst conditions were seen in the textile mills of New England. In the 1830s, a 10-year-old mill girl described her life.
We were paid $2 a week, and the working hours of all the girls extended from 5 o'clock in the morning till 7 in the evening, with 1.5 hour for breakfast and for dinner.
It was the hiring of children, some as young as 5 years old, throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, that outraged the public. Workers and reformers protested. They formed unions and associations and fought for government regulations to limit the workday and protect children. These laws helped address many of the abuses brought on by the Industrial Revolution. Today, we are in the middle of another revolution, a technological revolution. We live in what's called the global village. because we can connect with people around the world as if they lived next door. And we can now work anytime and anywhere. We will have to wait and see where this new revolution leads.
There. So that video gives you a little bit of a synopsis of some of the things we're going to be talking about here in the unit. Now for your reading. So go ahead to look at chapter 22.1, starting on page 508. Many factors aided industrial growth. And when you're done the reading, come back here and we will review it. All right, so welcome back. Let's go ahead and review what you've looked at. So the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, as you were reading, was none other than Great Britain. We've talked a lot about Great Britain in History 10, but it seems to be a great example to look at in terms of history, to give us kind of these basic ideas of the development of history. And yet again, Great Britain kind of is in the lead in terms of being the kickoff point or the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Like many things, the Industrial Revolution had both good and bad results. It not only improved the quality of lives of people, but it also inflicted great suffering on others, as we have begun to see. So there is one thing we want to look at. The guiding question is, was the Industrial Revolution a positive or a negative period in history? Was it a good thing or a bad thing, and why? And I think this would be an awesome essay question to look at. It's not the only question we're going to ask, but we can make judgments about, is the Industrial Revolution good or was it bad? And you could argue both. Now, here's a picture of what you might typically imagine the Industrial Revolution to be, and that is a big factory with smokestacks burning coal and just emitting these dark clouds through this manufacturing spree that begins to happen through the Industrial Revolution and all the technology that develops to spur this on, and as a result of the advances that are made during the Industrial Revolution. So let's get into this, but always keep in the back of your mind is, were there more positives to the Industrial Revolution or were there more negatives? Okay, we can also ask, how influential is the Industrial Revolution to our very lives today? And certainly you'll see that it quite is. Our lifestyle today is highly dependent upon what happened during the Industrial Revolution, just as much as it is on the development of the British government system and parliament system through history that we also have inherited as Canadians. So this is very impactful with the way that we live, for sure. Now, so the Industrial Revolution starts off with the Agricultural Revolution, which I think is a subject is very relevant to us, being that we are in an agricultural setting, a rural setting, and kind of a huge industry in our area is agriculture. So let's look and see this. This could be very interesting to a lot of you. Okay. The enclosure movement is the first thing that kicks off the agricultural revolution, which goes hand in hand with the industrial revolution. So revolutionary techniques and developments that apply to agriculture. Now, why? Because we begin to see the amassing and collection or whatnot, buying up of land of wealthy landowners. The village farmer then is made either to pay rent to farm that land as a tenant, renter of that land, or kicked off it completely as these farms begin to get bigger and bigger in Britain. And what we also see is that these farmers then, to delineate their land, would build hedges or fences around them, thus called the enclosure, because they would enclose these bigger tracts of land that would be under the ownership of a bigger landowner. We see the same sort of thing today, is that the small scale farmer, what we call small scale farmer, would have been probably much bigger than these wealthy landowners even back at this time. But we still see that where the small scale land owner or farmer is being bought out by bigger and bigger farms. And so agriculture is just expanding into bigger units, farming more and more land. And the same sort of thing you saw back then. Although keep in mind, it would, I don't know, a couple acre farm for a little family or a land tenant or whatnot, a peasant farmer being bought out or amassed. So what you see is blah, 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 all these little farms being kind of bought out and then enclosed by a great big hedge or a fence, thus called enclosure. Now, what's the significance of enclosure? Is that a farmer then had more land with which to experiment, a greater drive to make profit off of his land. And the result of that is that the farmer is more conditioned and can take risk then to experiment and develop efficiencies in his farming practice. So what ends up happening is that this sets up an environment by which a greater landowner can begin to experiment with greater efficiencies in using his land, take on that risk, and eventually have results that increase yields and make land use more efficient, as we will see. Okay, so the enclosure movement had to happen for agricultural revolution to happen, which made more profit from land and also made more food, made more efficient creation of food and yields of both crops and livestock. So the enclosure movement, very important to consider. And now we get to our first dude, our buddy Jethro Tull. And Jethro Tull is credited as inventing the seed drill in 1721. So the old method of planting crops would have been typically scattering seed, and that's a wasteful practice. A lot of it would have fallen on ground and never germinated. A lot of it would have blown away or been eaten by birds or such. But Jethro Tull invents the seed drill, which mechanizes the way of planting seed, and it can determine exactly where that seed falls, how deep, and at what spacing, etc. And it allows farmers then to sow seeds in spaced rows at measured depths and wastes way less seed because it can germinate exactly where you place it, if you've placed it at the right time and whatever. Now, this is something we depend upon today. A lot of you may know farmers who have technology for seeding and their farm machinery for seeding. It's very precision practice from what I understand. So the seed drill, towed by a horse or something and driven by the wheels here, and placing the seed in, you got these hoppers and it just places the seed down. So that's important because it makes more efficient use of seed, and it increases germination and yields because you aren't having, overcrowded crops, whatever. And it also makes it probably more quick and efficient to set and seed your crops in the first place. So number one, the seed drill with the agricultural revolution and Mr. Jethro Tull. Now, when we talk about farming in Europe during the Middle Ages and feudal system, we typically think of the three-field system. And that means that if they're germinating land or seed crops, they're growing crops on their land, a farmer will typically divide his land into three segments. Now, here you would have then a 3-year rotation or a three-field system in which you would grow crop 1, 2, and 3 and alternate them with any given year. Now, in this year 1, we take a look. We have whatever growing in crop 2 or field 2, or I guess this is crop number 2, field 2. And in field 3, we were growing crop number 1. But in field number 1, we are letting it lie fallow. That means we let weeds or the grass, we just let the land rest for a full year. You might graze animals on that, but then the next year you would rotate that over. So then in field 2, you would let it lie fallow. And then year 3, field 3, let it lie fallow. And then you grow your crops on the other alternating fields. So you let them have a period of rest. And farmers in the Middle Ages recognized that they had to do this. Otherwise, they just depleted the soil and nutrients of the land. But what it in effect ended up happening is that you think of this as all of Europe, okay? All of Europe, of all the farmland all the cropland in Europe. Now, if everybody's on this system, in essence, what it means is that in any one year, only 66-ish% of all the farmland is actually producing food, okay? 33% or a third is not. That is a deep sense. That's a big inefficiency because it's not 100%. It's not even 90%. It's like 60 It's a little over 60%. That's not a very good rating if you want to improve efficiencies of using your land to grow crops. So there's your 3-field system. And then we have our buddy named Charles Townsend, who is credited with experimenting on his land with crop rotation. And so what they found is that you could rotate different crops, such as barley and wheat, with other things like turnips or clover, and alternate them from year to year, meaning that you did not have to let your field lie fallow. You would plant wheat one year and then turnips the next, and then barley the next, and then clover the next. And while it is, planted as turnips, or while it's planted as clover, it becomes forage or food for your animals and livestock. So not only can you plant things on it and seed things to that land, but you can also use it to, animals transform it to meat. So you can improve your livestock diet as well. And at the same time, those crops like turnips and clover are fixing nitrogen and nutrients, whatever, into the soil and building your soil so that you can grow a heavy leaching crop like wheat on it. Now, I'm saying all this stuff. I am not a farmer. I think this is an impressive and amazing science, the science of crop rotation. It'd be a fantastic point of study. But I think that there's a lot of minds who are very expert on this in our farming environment of the idea of crop rotation today. And what ends up happening in effect here is that instead of 60%, 66% of the land being farmable in a given year, now 100% is. It's farmable, it's seeded, it's in production, it's actually contributing to food creation. So that's a huge improvement. If you improve something by like 40%, you're making a huge improvement, even 30%. So let's say 90% of farmland is producing food in some way. That's a big jump of efficiency in farming. So there you have it, Charles Townsend and crop rotation via use of turnips, which I actually hope to plant this year. And the last thing we'll look at with the agricultural revolution is Robert Bakewell. This is for our ranchers out there. Robert Bakewell really improved the science of livestock breeding, or kind of kicked this off in deliberately breeding and using selective breeding for specific traits. So not necessarily meat production, but maybe also wool or milk or eggs or whatever. And you get this idea or a science or breeding techniques today where selective breeding allows for a very specific type of animal with a specific characteristic that can be developed very efficiently for a specific purpose. So I love the stats here because I don't know too much about what animals are at today, but it's a huge leap again in efficiency of raising animals that Robert Bakewell practices and helps inspire other people to do this with their livestock also. So from 1700 to 1786, the average steer for slaughter went from, so this is 1700, was about 370 pounds when he went to slaughter. But by 1786, so less than 100 years later, the average went up to 840 pounds. And so that's over double in size. So in under a century, you're breeding to a point where you're doubling in size the meat production from one animal just by selective breeding. Now, sheep's a little bit even more impressive for meat, and that went from 28 pounds over the same period of time to 100 pounds. So that's like over three times the size. So selective breeding allows for a more efficient, better selected animal with actually bred for a very specific trait. And that increases its efficiency and use and purpose or whatever. You don't just let everything live and continue in the genetic line of that animal, but you pick and select what it is, what trait it is you want to develop in that breed. And again, not my area of expertise. There's a lot of ranchers around here who do that, and they build up their flock or herd or whatever with a very specific trait in mind. And again, very cool science, but it kicks off with the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution back in about 1700. So we're going to review the Agricultural Revolution by taking a look at this video, and join us right back here as we carry on with this chapter one of the Industrial Revolution.
From 1700 until the beginning of the First World War in 1914, a period of great social, political, and economic upheaval unfolded across the globe. Every aspect of daily life was transformed in some way. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain during the early part of the 18th century. Prior to this, life in Britain had remained largely unchanged for generations. People lived in agrarian societies. Farming was ruled by the seasons, and the harvest was at the mercy of the sun, rain, and wind. There are many contributing factors that made the Industrial Revolution possible. Too many to cover here. In this programme, we will focus on the Agricultural Revolution, the rise of the factory, new technology, and the role of Britain's empire. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be happy with the nickname turnip. Well, believe it or not, one Englishman, Lord Charles Townshend, was given the nickname Turnip Townshend, and we're about to find out why. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people in Britain lived in open-field villages. They relied on subsistence farming, which produced enough food for the peasants or tenants of the landowner, but little, if any, extra. Farmers used a system of rotating crops over 3 fields to grow food. Each year, 2 of the fields were used to grow crops, barley and wheat for example, while the 3rd field would lie fallow, left unplanted, to allow the soil to replenish lost nutrients. Livestock would graze in the fallow field, helping to fertilise the soil. In the following year, the crops would be rotated through the fields, 1 fallow, 2 productive. Peasant and village households were given a number of strips in the fields to plant their crops. From the 16th century onwards, landowners started turning open fields into enclosed paddocks that were assigned to a single farm. They wanted to bring their land under tighter control and make it more productive. This also meant the peasants were no longer able to strip farm and sometimes could not access water. Now unemployed, most of the peasants had 2 options: work as a hired labour on a farm or seek employment in town. Some of the larger landowners subdivided the land and then leased it back to the peasants. The way in which crops were sown was improved when, in 1700, Jethro Tull invented a horse-drawn seed drill that could plant 3 rows of seed at a time. It was able to drill a hole, drop the seeds in, and cover them over with soil in one action. Prior to this, seeds would be thrown by hand into the ploughed furrows. Some seed would be eaten by birds, and some blew away with the wind. Jethro Tull's seed drill dramatically improved production by increasing crop yields 5-fold. In 1730, the Rotherham triangular plough, patented by Joseph Folliambi, had an iron blade rather than wood, and its design made it lighter and easier to use than earlier ploughs. It required only 2 horses rather than 4, and 1 ploughman. The Rotherham plough had the dual benefit of cutting labour costs and saving time. And now we come to Turnip Townshend. During the 1730s, Lord Turnip Townshend introduced the Dutch 4-crop rotation system to Britain. The 4-crop rotation system rotated wheat, turnips, barley and cloves, for example, through 4 fields. The turnips and cloves helped nourish the soil with nutrients which, in turn, would produce a better wheat and barley crop the following year. In winter months, turnips were fed to livestock. This meant that it was no longer necessary for farmers to slaughter their beasts before winter. Improvements in farming had a dramatic social and economic impact in Britain. It now took fewer people to produce more food. By the end of the 18th century, farming had been transformed from primarily satisfying basic food and clothing needs of the village community into a commercial opportunity to sell the increasing food surplus to emerging local and foreign markets.
Okay, so let's carry on with a look at the Industrial Revolution now and population. So one of the things that we observe is a great period of growth unseen before in Europe and its population. Things doubling in whatever 100 years, as our text says. Something that says 400 years it took for the population to double, but up to from 350 to about 1750. But then after 1750 to 1850, the population of Europe doubles again. Here's a little chart that shows populations of 6 European nations from 1750 up to 1910. And you can see that they are depicted as increasing and growing. Okay, take France, for instance. Actually, I think this is a great look at. Okay, let's take Germany now. That's not fair. Let's look at Britain. So Britain goes from 10,000 to 4 times as much in 1910. France, 24,000 to this. This is not quite twice as much, but we do know that they, during this period of time, also had the French Revolution, which killed like a lot of people. Okay. By the way, this is in thousands, so I should add another million, whatever, onto this. So 10 million to 44 million. So what I usually do is I say, hey, take this chart and let's practice some math association. And can you put it into a line or bar graph or something like that? And you'd end up with something like this. So if we wanted to look at this in form of a graph, and historical graphs can show us change over time. And interestingly enough, we're also used to looking at graphs today in terms of, the rate of transmission, infection, healing, and whatever of recovery of COVID-19. But in this case, it's population. And you can see that Russia skyrockets here. And we have France kind of like doing this as we looked at. And Britain, you can see in the purple, kind of on the steady rise. So why on this steady rise? Why this flow of steady rise is a big question and a big mystery. But I think it has a lot to do with increased food production, better nourishment, and longer lifespan, as well as things like scientific discovery of medicines and human treatment to different ailments. And when you start looking through microscopes, you can see, bacteria and stuff like that. So we have a society which is growing in population, and they're living longer. And there's a smaller gap between generations. So people are, because of stability or comfort or whatever, are marrying and having families younger, which propels your population to grow faster and whatnot. So a lot of factors involved here. But I think the cool thing to note is that the population does rise and doubles very quickly. And which is interesting, because it's a result of the agricultural revolution, but it's also a cause of the industrial revolution, in that now you have a population base to manufacture huge things in huge numbers in these factories, but you also have a population base that has a job and an income who can become a consumer of those goods. So you can begin to see a familiarity with how society is changing in Europe, to be more familiar with what we live today, where we are both have a population base that provides their work and services, but they also, on the flip side, become a huge consumer base for those goods and services. So they feed into each other. So that's why we say this is a kind of a rapid rise in population, affects the Industrial Revolution, and is also affected by the Industrial Revolution. And really turns into an economic, but also a societal revolution. We talked a little bit, or we read a little bit about England being a great place to kind of inspire these ideas. Again, I want to point out that in England at this time has already had their civil war. They've already gone through their political upheaval, or are going through by 1660. So by 1700, they're very well founded. Grounded in their constitutional monarchy. And if you don't have a worry about political instability or war, like no wars were fought on British soil really beyond this point, um, then you have time to think about other things like science or developing ideas and encouraging a culture of innovation rather than one of like protection and trying to hold your country together and whatever, like the French are going to be doing in a century from now. So let's go ahead and look and see, why does this start in Great Britain? And there are 5 reasons why, and we'll review them here together. So first is natural resources. Great Britain has the resources that would drive the Industrial Revolution. Number 1, water power, first of all, and then later on, coal power, coal energy sources, and a supply of coal that would drive the factories during the Industrial Revolution. And then later on, iron ore, which would be used for construction and to drive the machinery and infrastructure that would be driven by the Industrial Revolution. And Britain had an abundance of all 3: water power, coal, and iron ore. And because they had access to those resources so readily, it was a perfect recipe to help with them, because they were 3 things that were very essential to any sort of industrialization pattern that we see in other countries beyond this point. But Great Britain kicks it off because they have access to these 3. The second is geography. England is strategically, I guess it has the advantage of being an island, isolated that way. They have a lot of shoreline, and they're protected from any political threat of war and things like that, just because they're out in the ocean. So they do have that advantage. But you also note a couple things here. They've got a favorable geography for transport and trade, mainly because they can have easy access from any point of the whole island, fairly easy. I mean, we're talking like we make a day trip by, driving to Regina or Medicine Hat and back, right? By the time we do that, we're halfway across Britain or more. All right. So we're not talking about huge distance here to get to a port or to get your good to a port. So they have great, many harbors and whatnot for ports, for trade and shipping. And they also have access then to global markets of raw materials to bring materials in and then ship them out as a more refined and valuable product, mainly because of their geography is favorable to that. We could also account for the rivers and whatnot, which would help with transport of goods in and out of land. And also the geography, just again, like the size. In time, they would build a railway network or a canal network. And you can do that in a country like this versus France, which is this huge expanse of land and only a very minimal port, access for shipping of goods. So geography is key for the Industrial Revolution. I hope that made sense. We've already talked a little bit about this. You have the Royal Society exchanging ideas. You have inventors building and improving upon prior inventions. And you have that whole pattern happening in England or in Britain. And of course, you also, because of the political stability and whatnot, you also have businesses and banks, which are eager to support and make loans and take risks to support new ventures, technologies, and industries and land acquisition or whatever, because you have the luxury to take risks because you have the political stability to live through whether that risk might fall through or not. At least your risk is not, another country might go to war, or we might have a civil war, or, a king might be bad and suddenly destroy the country. You don't have a lot of those risks in Great Britain at the time, whereas you would have in many other places. So you have a climate for ideas, and the incentive here is, again, that Enlightenment ideal of the free market system and the conclusion that humans are selfish people and they're looking out for their own profit. And because you have people seeking out wealth and their own profit, that is inspiring this idea of this climate of ideas that develops in Great Britain at the time. You have a great potential for taking risk in order to make profit and wealth. And that seems to be a driving force for the Industrial Revolution. Talked a little bit about this with that climate of ideas, or just that atmosphere of political stability, which is our last reason. but banking system as well. So briefly recap that Great Britain develops the most advanced banking system. They're the most wealthy nation in the world just because of their industry. And it only grows beyond that. They get a really big head start or leap ahead of other countries in this developing a banking system of loans and good interest rates and stability. People are encouraged then to invest in these ventures and to bank on the economy growing and propelling itself forward in growth. And the banks were taking on that risk too. So because you have this development of an effective banking system, that also impacts the Industrial Revolution. And last but not least, and I've already mentioned this just because to me it's just such a obvious reason as to why Great Britain is the key point of initiation of the Industrial Revolution, and that is political stability. Okay, we know they've already been fully evolved into their constitutional monarchy. They're operating with their three branches of government, their executive, legislative, and judicial branches. These were already things appreciated by Enlightenment thinkers of the time, and they had a somewhat of a form of democracy. And although they took part in wars through this time, none of them were fought on their own soil. So there's a sense of peace and prosperity, and all these things which contribute to the system of creation of ideas, their banking system, and all these things. Population growth and development of industry. Okay. You have in time, even more so, the growing merchant class getting representation in Parliament itself and propelling the country forward with the interests of the merchant and middle classes. So you have kind of this political system that becomes favorable to industry and profit and manufacture and mercantilism. And we talked about mercantilism back in Unit 2, which, was part of the economic theory or belief of Britain at the time, to make as most profit as they can off of their colonies by refining raw materials into more valuable goods and then trading them with the rest of the world. So there's your 5 reasons. So that brings us to our section review. Go ahead, take a look at the questions that are up for review, and when you think you have your responses, we will go through them together right away here. So let's do what we can to look through our section review in a quick fashion. You were asked to define Industrial Revolution: the period of increased output of goods made by machines and new inventions, or the rise in industry. Enclosure was the process by which those landowners bought up farmland, rented fields to tenant farmers, and new owners often fenced in their land, which is why they enclosed it in fences, bigger tracts of land called enclosure. Crop rotation. Well, crop rotation is that process of keeping a field fertile by planting different crops each year, allowing for 100% of cropland to be productive. The Royal Society. The Royal Society was that London club that exchanged scientific ideas, and really was a good example of this climate of ideas and development and building off one another's ideas and inventions in England, or London, Great Britain as a whole. Number 1 in our answers: when was the Industrial Revolution? Well, we said it takes place in the mid 1700s through the 1700s into the 18 and even 1900s. And how does it differ from other revolutions? Well, it is not a political revolution that's overthrowing a government or seeking new way of governing oneself politically, but it's an economic one, and it becomes a social one as well, as we will see. Next question: how does this enclosure movement, this bigger tracts of land and enclosing them, help scientific farming? Well, it allows a landowner with a large estate to be able to be free to experiment with scientific farming methods with the purpose of making it more efficient and having better production. but it has a secondary effect, because how does it affect the labor force? Well, it forces small farmers off the land, reducing the number of farmers farming land, and it actually, so in doing that, it allows for a new workforce of people who are not farming anymore. So they are available to do other work that maybe didn't exist before, such as mass manufacture within a factory or something. And how does rising population help the Industrial Revolution? It supplies those extra workers, and the extra population creates a demand, a consumer base for goods, as we mentioned as well. And we look to question 3. What were those 5 factors that we've just reviewed? Number 1, let's see if I can remember them. Number 1, resources. There you go. Abundant natural resources, especially water, power, coal, and iron. Number 2, geography. Yeah, an island. Britain was an island, had many harbors, and was an optimal system for transport of goods and raw materials. Oh, I clicked it too fast. What was the third one? A climate of ideas. There you go. Just like we had reviewed the Royal Society being an example for that. But I think it's neat because in Britain at the time, you have an invention, but then you have another guy coming, as we'll see, who perfects that invention a little bit more. And they build off each other, much like that quote from Newton that we looked at the beginning of History 10, which said that, if he has accomplished anything, it's because he stood on the shoulders of giants. And this idea that we share and pass on and inherit human knowledge with the idea of perfecting and developing it, that's such a cool thing, as we'll see. Oh, I clicked again. The next one was the banking system. With loans available at reasonable rates, banks willing to take risk, investments, all that type of thing, for people who are entrepreneurial to actually make a profit. And you have a whole growing new class of people becoming wealthy at this point in time because of the ability to take financial risk. And the last one, which is kind of undermining all of these things, is the political stability which Great Britain has. There were no wars on British soil, and they had the political stability and ability to take the risk. Now, was a revolution in agriculture necessary to the Industrial Revolution? Explain. I think you could look at this 2 ways. Yes, it was necessary because it increases food production, which helps to sustain and nourish a growing population base. And the second reason is that it actually displaces those small farmers so that they are now a new segment of the population, or an increasing segment of the population, that can be dedicated workforce for the Industrial Revolution. So 2 reasons: to nourish the growing population and to displace people so that they would work in the factories. Okay, that's it. Let's go ahead and wrap this one up. In the meantime, don't be lame. I will see you next chapter. Take care.